When a disabled veteran and his loyal service dog are treated unfairly at an airport, something incredible happens. Strangers come together, and one unexpected hero steps forward. The terminal at Chicago O'Hare International Airport buzzed with the usual chaos of a busy travel day. Suitcases rolled across the floor, overhead announcements echoed through the spacious hall, and travelers rushed from gate to gate, eyes glued to their phones or tugging children behind them. Near gate B-17, a man in his late 40s stood quietly with a black Labrador retriever sitting calmly at his side. David Miller, a retired Army veteran, wore a faded jacket with a small patch that read U.S. Army and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. His dog Charlie wore a bright blue vest with the words, "Service Dog Do Not Pet," embroidered on both sides. For most, it was just another day at the airport, but for David, traveling was a challenge. Every loud sound, every sudden movement set his nerves on edge. Years of service overseas had left him with invisible scars, and Charlie was his anchor, trained to keep him calm when anxiety and panic threatened to take over. Today, David was flying to Seattle to attend a veterans' mental health conference, where he hoped to share his experiences and advocate for others like him. Though he had done this before, flying was never easy, but with Charlie by his side, he felt prepared to manage. As he waited for boarding to begin, he adjusted Charlie's vest and took a deep breath, unaware that the simple act of boarding this flight was about to become a public battle for dignity and respect. When the boarding announcement for Flight 289 to Seattle crackled over the intercom, David gathered his things, giving Charlie a reassuring pat before stepping forward to the gate. He handed over his boarding pass with a polite nod, along with Charlie's service dog documentation, something he always carried just in case. The gate agent, a woman in her 30s with a polished uniform and a forced smile, took the documents and began typing into her tablet. But instead of the usual brief check and nod of approval, she frowned, her fingers hovering uncertainly over the screen. Mr. Miller," she said hesitantly, glancing over at Charlie. "I'm sorry, but it looks like there may be an issue with bringing your dog onto this flight." David blinked, confused. "An issue? He's a registered service animal. I have all the paperwork right here." He tapped the folder in his hand for emphasis, trying to keep his voice calm. The agent leaned in slightly, lowering her voice, as if embarrassed to be having this conversation publicly. "There's been a policy update. Larger animals, even service dogs, might not be permitted on this flight." David's stomach tightened. "That can't be right," he said, his voice steady but laced with frustration. "Charlie isn't a pet. He's trained to keep me safe. I can't fly without him." The agent gave him an apologetic look but stood firm. "I'm really sorry, sir, it's out of my hands." As she spoke, passengers behind David slowed down, their attention caught by the rising tension. Charlie, sensing David's stress, pressed gently against his leg, a quiet reminder that he wasn't alone, though in that moment it was starting to feel like he might be. As David stood there trying to make sense of the situation, passengers nearby began to take notice. The line for boarding slowed to a crawl as more people overheard bits and pieces of the conversation. A middle-aged woman in a business suit holding a laptop bag furrowed her brow, pausing to listen. A young man in a college sweatshirt leaned on his backpack, clearly curious about the unfolding scene. An older gentleman with a cane shuffled closer, his sharp eyes narrowing as he picked up on David's growing frustration. David took a deep breath, struggling to keep his voice even, but there was a growing edge to it. "Look," he said firmly, "this dog is my lifeline. Without him I can't do this. I've got everything you need. The papers, the ID. There's no reason to deny us." The gate agent looked uncomfortable, glancing nervously at the people gathering around. "I understand, sir," she said, her voice lower now, "but I'm just following the airline's updated protocol. I don't make the rules." Just then a supervisor, a tall man in a crisp uniform with a badge that read Customer Service Manager, approached, his expression serious but polite. "Sir, I'm the supervisor on duty. I understand there's some confusion here, but unfortunately, due to new company guidelines, larger animals, including some service dogs, are now restricted on specific flights." David's heart sank. He felt the pressure of all the watching eyes, but he wasn't going to back down. "So let me get this straight," he said, his voice louder now. "You're telling me that after everything I've been through serving this country, and after everything Charlie does for me, you're going to deny me the right to board a flight because of a policy you don't even fully understand?" The murmuring of the crowd grew louder, a ripple of disbelief passing through the line. The businesswoman shook her head, muttering, "This can't be right," while the older man stepped forward slightly, his hand resting firmly on his cane, ready to speak up if needed. The tension around Gate B-17 was only beginning to mount. Just as the crowd around Gate B-17 grew more restless, a new voice cut through the murmur. Calm, clear, but filled with quiet authority. "Excuse me, what's happening here?" All eyes turned to see Barron Trump, standing just a few feet away holding a small carry-on bag in his boarding pass. His presence immediately caused a ripple of recognition to pass through the gathering crowd. Tall, composed, and much more grown than most remembered, Barron's sharp gaze moved from the supervisor to David and then to Charlie, taking in the situation quickly. The supervisor, visibly caught off guard, straightened his posture. "Sir, this gentleman's service dog doesn't comply with updated airline policies. We're trying to resolve the matter." But Barron didn't look satisfied with that answer. "Doesn't comply," he repeated, his voice calm but laced with disbelief. "This man is a veteran, and that's a clearly marked service dog. What part of this situation makes sense to you?" The crowd seemed to lean in closer, emboldened by Barron's sharp challenge. David looked up, surprised that someone was speaking out for him. The supervisor fumbled for words. "Sir, these are the company's new policies." But Barron didn't back down. "Policies don't override federal law," he said firmly. "Service animals are protected, and you know that. Are you really prepared to deny this man his rights because of a rule you probably weren't even properly trained on?" A young woman holding a child nearby nodded in agreement, adding, "Yeah, this is wrong." Barron turned to David, offering a hand. "Thank you for your service, sir. You shouldn't have to fight this fight." As they shook hands, the tension in the room shifted. Where before David had stood alone, now he had an ally, and the growing crowd seemed ready to follow his lead. More passengers began filming, whispering words of support, and some called out, "Let them board." The supervisor's once confident stance now visibly wavered, as the pressure from Barron and the crowd began to turn the tide. As Barron's words hung in the air, a wave of agreement rippled through the crowd. More passengers stepped forward, their quiet observations turning into vocal support. "This isn't right," the businesswoman said firmly, crossing her arms. "That dog is trained to help him. You can't just decide he's not allowed." The older man with the cane took a step closer to David and added, "I served too. You don't turn your back on people who gave everything for this country." From behind the gate, a young father with a stroller called out, "If they can do this to him, what's stopping them from doing it to anyone with a disability?" The supervisor looked increasingly uncomfortable, glancing toward the gathering crowd as more phones came out to record. Barron took a step forward, standing side by side with David. "We're not asking for anything unreasonable," Barron said, his voice calm but strong. "We're asking for decency, for a man who served this country and a dog that's trained to protect him." The tension thickened as a teenage boy nearby raised his phone, recording, and said aloud, "The whole world's gonna see this." The gate agent looked visibly nervous, whispering to another staff member as the supervisor's authority seemed to erode with every passing second. "What happened to basic respect?" the older gentleman muttered, his voice sharp. David, clearly moved by the growing support, swallowed hard, glancing around at the strangers now standing up for him. Charlie stayed pressed to David's side, his calm demeanor a sharp contrast to the brewing storm. The energy in Gate B-17 had shifted from quiet tension to a unified front, and it was clear the airline wouldn't win this fight without facing public backlash. After several tense minutes, with the crowd watching and phones still recording, the supervisor stepped away to make a call, disappearing into a nearby office. The crowd remained still, eyes locked on the door, waiting. When he finally re-emerged, his face looked pale and strained, his authority visibly shaken. Approaching David and Barron, he cleared his throat and said, "Sir, after speaking with corporate, We've been authorized to allow you and your service dog to board this flight." A wave of relief and quiet applause rippled through the passengers. But David didn't smile. Instead, he stood straighter, his voice steady but resolute. "With all due respect, this shouldn't be an exception," he said firmly. "No veteran or disabled person should have to go through this to beg for their rights to be acknowledged." Barron nodded beside him, adding, "He's right. You're fixing this for today, but what about tomorrow? What about the next person who doesn't have a crowd to speak up?" The supervisor shifted uncomfortably, murmuring, "We'll be reporting this incident to upper management for review." Though the words felt rehearsed, it was clear the airline had no choice but to back down. David looked at the people around him, strangers who had become allies, and finally a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Thank you, all of you," he said quietly, his eyes glancing down at Charlie, who wagged his tail gently, sensing that the storm had passed, for now. As the boarding process finally resumed, David took a deep breath, adjusting Charlie's vest and gently running his hand over the dog's head for reassurance. The crowd around him slowly parted, creating a pathway as he approached the gate. Some people reached out to pat him on the shoulder while others offered soft, encouraging words. "Thank you for standing up," a young mother whispered, holding her toddler close as she looked at David with genuine compassion. "You shouldn't have had to fight for that." David managed a small nod in response, but emotion tightened his throat and he could only offer a quiet, "Thank you," in return. As David walked down the jetway, Barron stood back, arms crossed but with a faint knowing smile, a mix of pride and quiet satisfaction. Watching David and Charlie go, he seemed deep in thought, reflecting on the power of standing up for what's right. At the aircraft door, a flight attendant greeted David warmly, her smile soft and understanding. She bent down to give Charlie a gentle scratch behind the ears, whispering, "We're glad to have you both on board, sir." David made his way to a window seat, and as Charlie curled loyally at his feet, David finally let out a long breath, a release of the tension and exhaustion that had built up. But along with the relief, there was a new feeling. For the first time in a long while, he felt seen, heard, and respected. Back at the gate, Barron lingered a moment longer, watching as the plane prepared for departure. A woman in her 30s approached him, her voice full of gratitude. "Most people would have stayed quiet. What you did, what everyone did, mattered." Barron gave a soft nod. "Sometimes people just need a reminder that they can make a difference," he said quietly, before finally turning to board. But the impact of that moment would stay with everyone who had witnessed it, long after the plane took off. The scene at Gate B-17 was more than just a moment of conflict. It became a powerful reminder that when one person stands up, others will follow. David and Charlie's fight for respect was not theirs alone by the end. It was shared by strangers who refused to stay silent. Barron Trump's courage to speak out ignited a spark that gave the entire crowd permission to act. The moral is simple but profound. Injustice thrives in silence, but courage is contagious. Whether in an airport terminal or in everyday life, we all have a choice: to look away or to stand up. Standing up for what's right may be uncomfortable, but it's necessary because sometimes all it takes is one voice to start a wave of change. Let this story remind us: compassion and courage can turn strangers into allies and small moments into movements. The story of David and his service dog Charlie teaches a powerful lesson about the importance of standing up for others, especially when they are treated unfairly. In a world where many people choose to stay silent, one voice can make a difference. Barron Trump's decision to step in and challenge the airline's unfair treatment of David shows that courage is contagious. Once he spoke up, others followed, and together they changed the outcome. The story reminds us that rules and policies should never override human dignity and compassion, especially for those who have served their country or live with disabilities. It also highlights that people with disabilities should not have to fight for basic rights, like traveling with a trained service animal. Most importantly, the lesson is that we all have a responsibility to act when we see something wrong, no matter how small the action may seem. Standing up for what is right can inspire others and bring real change. In a world that often feels divided, Moments of unity and collective action show the power of kindness, empathy, and courage to make things better for everyone.